Hello and welcome to the winter seminars of the 2022 of the Rapool Baltics. My name is Šmīja and I'm International Product Manager for Hybrid Rye here at Saaten-Union. Today I would like to talk to you about hybrid rye and the opportunities and challenges that the crop brings with it. So first of all, I would like to just give you a brief overview about the challenges that we see, I think, Europe-wide and to different extents regarding, for example, plant protection, biotic stresses, abiotic stresses, but also fertilization. So if we are looking into plant protection, we see definitely a loss of active ingredients throughout Europe. We do see different problems with seed treatment, but also in terms of disease tolerance and resistance. In terms of biotic stresses, we do see problems with rust, fusarium, ergot, but also virus problems. If we're looking to abiotic stresses, we also see definitely challenging times coming up with the topic of climate change, but also extreme weather events. Another topic is the topic of fertilization. There we do see problems in terms of more increasing N restrictions, but also the topic of N efficiency is becoming more and more important. So what I would like to talk about today is the topic of N efficiency, but also the topic of ergots, and would like to show you some more detailed information about these two topics. So the first topic is the increasing importance of inefficiency, and I would like to show this to you with an example coming from Germany. So here you can see a map from Germany with some marked red and green areas. And this map is showing basically the chemical conditions of groundwater bodies regarding nitrate levels in the groundwater. In the EU, we have a threshold value of 50 milligrams per liter of groundwater. And in the red areas, you can see where we do have an extension of the threshold value. And if you look into the western part, this is basically the part of Germany where we have intensive production of animal husbandry, and some other parts in Germany where we see intensive production of basically more or less vegetables. So basically really two N-intensive regions, and basically also in these regions you can see quite many regions being above the threshold level. So what is the situation like in Germany then with these with these areas? So the reaction from the German authorities was that they defined so-called red areas where the groundwater levels exceeded the nitrate threshold level. So what does this mean especially for the farmers working in these areas? We have stricter regulations that go beyond the actual standard fertilizer regulation. So this means in all these areas where we have all these red areas, we have to produce our crops with 20% less fertilization in terms of nitrogen. Additionally, we are only allowed to use 170 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare from organic fertilizer. Additionally, also it's only allowed to have 170 kilograms of nitrogen from organic and mineral fertilizer coming above it over a 2-year average into the field. We are not allowed in fall to apply any nitrogen either to rapeseed, to barley, or to any cover crops. Another point is that we have to establish a catch crop prior to our spring crop that we would establish then in the spring. So what does this actually mean for us? We have to take care of our N budget, and therefore we also have to increase our N efficiency. So how can we actually do this by using rye? So here you can see a graphic where there was the nitrate level that was taken up by different cover crops. And in this case, you can see that with the highest rate of cover crop density with 100%, you can see that rye sown early has the highest nitrate uptake. Even if you sow rye at a later point, you can still see one of the highest uptakes of nitrate. And therefore, this means that you're allowed, or that it gives you the possibility to catch quite much of the nitrate that is still in the soil prior to the winter and over the winter time. Here at Saaten-Union, we also did a trial in Germany where we looked at different nitrogen intensity levels and to see what is the reaction of the crop. In this case, we compared rye and wheat to each other. We had in total 4 different variants that we were assessing. So we had the N1, which was a rye that was stabilized, or the N fertilizer was stabilized. So we had a total of 120 kilogram of nitrogen applied for rye and also for wheat, and then this in a replicated trial. Then we had another variant where we used the conventional N application for rye, which was also then 120 kilogram, but split it into 2 fertilization stages. Then we had a variant where we looked at wheat in a stabilized way, where we applied a total of 180 kilogram of nitrogen, split it in a stabilized way into 150 and 30 kilogram. Then we had another conventional wheat application system where we applied also the 180 kilograms, but we split it in 3 different applications. So we had 100 kilogram in the first instance and then twice 40 kilogram in the later stages. So what we could clearly see is that rye was always the crop that had the higher yielding in comparison to wheat. Even with the 120 kilogram of nitrogen applied, we were able to see that the yield of rye was higher than the yield of wheat that we saw with 180 kilogram fertilized. Another factor that we integrated in here was the irrigation. So on the left-hand side, you see the non-irrigated variants, and on the right-hand, you can see the irrigated variants. Nevertheless, the irrigation on this trial did not really have significant effects on the yield level. But generally what we see, of course, and this is also something that you would expect, is that you see a yield increase with the increase of N fertilization. Even with lower nitrogen levels, you could still see that rye was performing way better than wheat on these weaker locations. Another point that we, in this case, were looking at was the N balance, or basically what has been left in the soil in terms of nitrogen. And what you can see here is that the N removal from hybrid rye was much higher in all the cases than it was for wheat. With 120 kilogram nitrogen fertilizer applied, you could see that rye was able to basically take all of the nitrogen out of the soil, whereas we still had in wheat, we still had a positive balance. So we still had much nitrogen in the soil, which was basically then left and not used by the crop. You could see that under the irrigated system, you had a slightly higher N uptake in comparison to the non-irrigated variant. Nevertheless, over all variants, we had always the case that hybrid rye was taking much more nitrogen or using the nitrogen much more efficiently than wheat was doing it. So with this, I would like to come to the next topic, which is ergot, and I would just like to talk about the management and the experiences that we've seen over the past years. So to start this topic, I would like to talk about the upcoming amendment of the EU regulation regarding ergots. So in the past, there was also only the assessment of ergots itself in terms of threshold values, and now it's also coming into play that the regulatory bodies are looking at ergot alkaloids, and we have now threshold values also for these alkaloids coming up from this year, and they will be tightened within 2 years. So with the alkaloids, this is the problem that we are not able to make a quick assessment for these alkaloids, which is in comparison possible with the ergots. Additionally, we don't see any correlation between the ergots that we see in the yield and the ergot alkaloids that we have then potentially measured. So, and we are also still not sure where a potential contamination could come from. Is this maybe from ergot break or some other reasons? But anyway, there's the possibility of a high contamination. So what is ergot? So ergot is basically an ascomycete, which is a fungi. And it is a biotrophic flower parasite that is mostly found on cross-pollinated plants, basically grasses. The ergots that you can see in your yield are basically the fungi's stage for winter survival. So these fungi or these ergots will flower again within the next spring and will then be ready again to release spores that then will infect your plants, or basically also other grasses that are growing around the ergots. So, and then within the new season and the spores being released, we see that these spores are then coming to the first flowering grasses that are mostly on the field borders, and these are then basically the inoculum sources that spread the inoculum throughout the season and also then to the rye. So what are the factors for ergot infection then? So the main factor really is the environment. So with 70%, we estimate that this is the highest impact on the ergot infection. Then your production. So how do you produce your rye? How do you treat it? How is the crop establishment going? These are also big factors. And then the variety has only a minor effect on the ergot infection. And this is then basically triggered by the flower characteristic, by the resistance, and also by pollen shedding. So, but what influences the ergot susceptibility? So there are at least 3 mechanisms that have basically the biggest influence on this topic. So on the one hand, it's the flower characteristic. So it's the flowering time, the stigma size, and also the stigma dehydration after the pollination. Then another topic is pollen shedding. So how big is the crop's ability to actually fertilize and pollinate other plants that are surrounded? And then the third topic is resistance. So what are there mechanisms that prevent the fungi's entry or the spread in the female flower parts? What is actually coming into play is what are the weather conditions around flowering time. So this is really the most important topic that you have to look at, but this is something, unfortunately, that we cannot change. So, as I already mentioned, so cool and wet weather conditions have the biggest influence on the ergot infection. So, and this is basically through negative effects on the meiosis, which negatively affects the pollen production, but also the availability of pollen. So we have a higher risk that pollen might clump. It's not distributed so far as we would see it in warmer and nice weather conditions. And the third point is that the florets will stay open much longer to actually receive pollen. And therefore, as we have an open flower for a longer time, the risk for an ergot infection is dramatically increasing. But how to manage ergot actually in crop protection, and what are the measures that we can do to actually prevent an ergot infection or to reduce the risk of ergot infections? So the first and biggest important thing is we have to establish a dense and well-nourished cereal stand. So this is really important, and this can be done by, in the first instance, starting with an enhanced end fertilization to actually be able to establish really a nice and dense crop stand. It's important to avoid extremely early sowings, because if you have an overgrown crop stand in the next spring, it's going to be really difficult, and there may be the risk that this overgrown crop stand might develop side shoots and late tillers. And these late tillers or side shoots are extremely affected or can be extremely affected by ergots because they will flower at a different time than the normal stand. Therefore, you will have less pollen available for these side shoots and late tillers. And as these will receive less pollen, the ergot infection risk is increasing dramatically. Additionally, be really careful with the use of plant growth regulators. In the best case, you will apply it in BBCH 31, 32, and this should be then really the biggest and most important measure because later on you will have the risk of the ear getting stuck, and so this is really the best option if you come early with the plant growth regulator, and this really helps to establish a well and not overgrown crop stand. And as I already mentioned, avoid late tillers and side shoots because this is really the highest risk because they have another flowering time. They will not flower like the whole crop stand at all, and therefore you will increase the risk that there's less pollen available to actually pollinate these plants. Then, of course, crop rotation is also a very important point, especially in no tillage systems. So if you plow your crop or the soil after the harvest, you will be able to bury the sclerotia in the soil, and therefore they will not be longer available, or at least not staying alive, and therefore this really much helps you to decrease the inoculum source for the upcoming seasons. So in the best way, you would make the crop rotation with a non-susceptible crop like a non-cereal, which would really much help you to reduce the risk of further build-up of inoculum in the soil. Another point is that you have to control grasses and voluntary cereals on the field because they can also act as an inoculum source for your hybrid rye crop. Then, of course, as I already mentioned, environmental conditions are one of the biggest factors influencing the ergot infection. So therefore, you really have to try to avoid any irrigation during flowering time because these wet conditions will definitely make the pollen availability much lower and therefore increase the risk of ergot infections. And then, in case that you have infected field parts, do harvest them separately because this will then decrease the amount of ergot that you find in your actual harvest yield. So therefore, really try to use certain problem lots in a different way, for example, for bioethanol or biogas production. So what I would like to show you here is the annual variation of ergot levels that we see in the Polish post-registration trials. The most interesting thing here is that we can see is that we have natural infection. We are just looking in the way how it's also looking in the field, in the practice on your farm, basically. And what you can see here, so we have here data for several varieties from 2017 until 2020. And what you can see here is that a variety that shows in 1 year really low levels, way below the average, is in another year, like in 2020, for example, showing average values or values that are way beyond the average. So what you can really see here, if you're looking at Horizon, for example, it has really a really low ergot level in the year of 2018, but in the year of 2020, the ergot values are coming up so far, way beyond the average. And this is something that you can also see in other varieties. So therefore, it's really not something that you can describe for one variety is better than the other. It's more about the environmental conditions in 1 year. This is really the key factor for ergot infection. And in the first instance, it's not the variety. Something we can also see here is looking at the average annual ergot values as an average over all the varieties from 1 year. And what you can see here, it's really a year effect. So there's a year like 2017 where you have 234 milligrams per kilogram of rye yield. And in years like 2018, 2019, you have comparably low yields. And then you have a year like 2020 where the ergot levels are going up so far, like nearly, or that they are above 650 milligrams per kilogram. So as you can see, what I've already mentioned, so it's really not just the variety, but it's also very much a year effect. So, and what you can see here is also basically the data from these post-registration trials from Poland, again from 2017 to 2020. And what I've done here is on the left side from the numbers you can see the ergot levels, and on the right hand side you can see the heading date. Basically, it's the deviation from the average, and you can see I've just highlighted here some of the years and some of the varieties. So what you can see here is basically that certain heading dates mostly correlate with certain ergot levels. This is not always the case because we also sometimes have variety characteristics that are coming into play, but generally in kind of a tendency you can see that certain heading dates in certain years are showing really much higher or lower ergot levels. So for example, if you look in 2017, you see really high ergot values correlating with rather a late flowering time. If you look in 2018, so for example, there's Esunasri just at the bottom, which is flowering quite at an early time. It has a much higher ergot level than varieties flower earlier, like Esu Avid, for example. So for example, looking at Esu Nasri, we can see a very early heading date seems to have a really negative influence in this year on the ergot levels. If you have a later flowering time, like you can see, for example, also with Esu Avid, we already have better ergot values to be seen here. And this is something that we experience throughout many years and always in different ways. So the heading date is definitely a factor influencing the ergot levels. Again, this is just an overview over 4 years, but again, different varieties for post-registration trials. And I would just like to summarize what I've just described to you throughout the past slides. So we have annual variation, a high annual variation in ergot levels over the years. We do have a high variation between varieties within 1 year. So one variety can have really low values in 1 year, but in the second year, the ergot values may rise up just due to the flowering time and the weather conditions around flowering time. So then we have a really high variety-specific variation within 1 year or within many years. So in 1 year, as I just said, you can have really low values, and in the second year, the values may rise up and are higher than compared to another variety that we've seen in the previous year. So the variety itself has a minor effect, as I already tried to explain you many times now. So basically the environmental conditions, basically the weather conditions around flowering time are the most important thing for ergot infections. So yeah, as I mentioned, weather conditions are really the key factor for ergot infections. So what we can do is try to establish the best possible crop stand that we are able to do with our knowledge and how we know that we have to produce on our fields. And then the addition of 10% population rye can really much help you to increase the pollen availability within the field, and therefore even more strongly reduce the risk of ergot infections in your field. So now coming to the summary. So we looked at inefficiency and we looked at ergot. So for the inefficiency, we can see that hybrid rye is one of the best solutions for resource-friendly crop production. We have seen that it relieves strict fertilizer budgets by allowing the possibility generating high yields with low fertilizer inputs, which would help us to generate, to put higher end fertilization maybe into other crops if we then look at the end fertilization average over several years. And I think this is really interesting, especially if we look at the high nitrogen and fertilizer prices in general that we see at the moment throughout the world. So additionally, it prohibits the leaching of nutrients in general, but in this case also nitrate, into groundwater, and therefore it basically just saves us money which would otherwise be lost into the groundwater. Looking into the ergot topic, so we've seen clever crop management is really the key foundation for establishing a nice crop stand and therefore allowing us to reduce the risk of ergot infections. Then the second factor, this is something that we cannot influence, is the weather conditions. So these have really the biggest impact then on the occurrence of ergot. And as last point, the comparison, if we look into the practice fields, it's really difficult to compare one field with another because every crop has its own characteristics. There are differences. When you sow it, how is the variety dealing with the end fertilization? What is the heading date? What were the weather conditions around the heading date? So there are so many interactions and factors that are influencing how the crop stand looks at a certain level, and therefore it's really hard to compare one field with another. So with this, I would like to finish my presentation. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, wish you a nice day and enjoy the other presentations.